So this is going to take you through an example IOC using the physical outlines that are prepared for you and keeping you visually in touch with a plan that I've already completed as an example of what an IOC might look like with Seamus Heaney's poem A Shiver. It's going to take you through the intro using the GST structure, outlining the central concern of the poem, the three stylistic focuses that make up the body of the commentary, and then the thesis statement about its central meaning. The first paragraph concerns an event rather than a character or a setting, about the action of knocking down a wall, highlighting the transition from awestruck fascination to fear. And then the supporting details are outlined here, including the direct naming of the techniques that are being analysed. Concluding sentence of that section, we're moving to the second paragraph, which is focused on sound devices and form, revealing the dangerous consequences of a consciousness of power. Then finally, we move into a single paragraph focused on language details, where figurative language, building into the extended metaphor comparing the wall to 9/11, reveals anxiety about power and our fascination with it. Then a short conclusion, missing out the specific component and just dealing with the thesis re-articulated, and then the text as a warning component of the general structure of the conclusion. So I'm going to go through this part by part, and I'll keep pointing at the section that I'm using. So, the problematic nature of power has been a concern of all poets throughout the ages. Heaney depicts the troubling consequences of developing an awareness of power in his sonnet, A Shiver. Firstly, he represents the action of his father destroying a wall in order to highlight the problematic nature of a developing fascination with power, shifting into our conscious awareness of possessing that power. He then uses sound devices and the sonnet form and variations of that sonnet form in the poem in order to reveal the dangerous consequences of developing that awareness of power. Finally, Heaney also uses a series of examples of figurative language that build an extended metaphor, comparing the act of smashing the wall down, of his father smashing the wall down, with the terrorist atrocities committed on 9/11, revealing an anxiety about the tension between being fascinated with power and the dangerous ramifications of this. While the poem seems to reveal an empathetic understanding of our fixation with power, it alarmingly concludes that this fascination with power can transform into a form of self-consciousness that may become the basis for further atrocity. So Heaney, throughout the poem, represents the action of his father knocking down the wall with delicate skill and physical strength. And that focus on this action creates a sense of transition from awestruck fascination to fear towards the concluding parts of the poem. Firstly, Heaney opens by describing the physical positioning of his father, claiming, as he recollects the memory, that the way you had to stand was distinctive. Now, the direct address here between the speaker and the father who is described in the text gives us this tone of precaution, as if the physical action is in some way potentially hazardous or dangerous, and that's a conclusion that the poem later reaches. Within that quote, the word stand, I think, also functions as a pun, revealing a sense of physical standing, but also the mental standing for a cause that seems to blur the boundaries between the physical action of knocking down the wall and the potentially politically rebellious action that it metaphorically represents from the perspective of terrorists in the Middle East. Contained within that pun is that sense of physical power in the present, and then also metaphorical danger through the extended metaphor. Furthermore, Heaney describes in great detail how the spine and waist become a pivot for the tight-braced, tilting rib cage, as he visually constructs the action of swinging the sledgehammer and the anatomical movements that follow from this action. The line break just after the word waste, before the word pivot, mimics the idea of pivoting as the meaning of the lines shifts with enjambment across that particular line break. We have this sense then of movement, of dynamic movement, shifting beyond the visual constraints in which it's supposed to be contained. The compound adjectives of tight-braced, tilting rib cage in the poem itself give us a sense of bracing that is partly being represented through the imagery here of someone's body being braced for impact, which again builds into this concerned sense of bracing the Twin Towers for impact and during the moment of collision in 9/11. Finally, Heaney ends with this alarming image of the hammer smashing into the wall and the vibrations from the hammer being felt up the arms. He questions whether it is good for us to have known it in your bones, directable and withholdable at will. And here it personifies the vibrations of the sledgehammer on impact, being the vibrations known in your bones that become directable and withholdable at will. That sense of the physical power becomes a knowledge in the bones, a deep sense of awareness that becomes problematic towards the climax of the poem. In addition, the truncated line length of withholdable at will mirrors that sudden restriction of in the form of a person gaining an awareness deep in their bones of power and then being able to restrain it and control it with ease. So while in the poem the initial power is a source of fascination, it later portrays the effects of smashing down the wall and gaining an awareness of one's own power and capability. Heaney uses sound devices and form to emphasize the dangerous consequences of the consciousness of power. Firstly, in the opening lines, he initially uses a great deal of sibilance in the words stand, swing, and sledge. Those words creating that whispering echo that's deliberately, I think, supposed to foreground the sound of the sledgehammer swinging through the air and the sound potentially of the metaphorical planes flying through the sky, which gives us this sense of restrained power about to let fly, which is one of his own phrases. Also in the opening lines, there's quite a strong K alliteration in lock, back, and shock fast in that compound adjective again, which again forces a kind of bracing effect as the K sound forces us into producing that abrupt, jolting noise of impact. So within those sounds, there is a sense of power and then the shock that it's capable of inflicting. Following this, he uses components of the sonnet form and variations of it in order to create a sense of profound meaning. The line about to let fly that pivots across the volta of the sonnet, the point of transition between the octet and the sestet, suggests a sense of uncontrollable or restrained power, as the quote itself and its pivot is further on in the poem than we would typically find, which suggests that something is not being contained within the parameters and the boundaries that we would expect to find in a sonnet, which is precisely the anxiety that the poem seems to express, that power is not being contained in the way that we would expect. The colon, I think, emphasizes that point of transition and shifts seamlessly into the reflective question that concludes the poem. Finally, we see in lines across lines 2 and 3, 5 and 6, and 7 and 8, and the various clauses in the final sentences, a sense of enjambment running across those lines and dynamic movement being described within them in order to describe this dynamic unfolding of the physical movement of the swinging of the sledgehammer and the extraordinarily uncontrollable nature of the powerful terrorist atrocity that the poem metaphorically represents. The commas in those final clauses, I think, add precision to those reflective questions that Heaney asks in the final line of the text. So where some aspects of the form celebrate that sense of fascination with awe and power, others embody that notion of power spiraling out of control. Heaney utilizes figurative language to build an extended metaphor comparing the swinging of the sledgehammer to the terrorist atrocities of 9/11 in order to present his anxiety about power and the problematic nature of our fascination with this. Firstly, the simile that opens the poem, where Heaney describes his father's lower back locked shock fast as shields in a testudo, brings with it, through that simile, describing a Roman shield formation, connotations of violence and the loss of empire that builds this extended metaphor comparing the swinging of the sledgehammer to an empire that's contemporaneous with the poem, the contemporary empire of America, and that potential reaction to that empire being the motivating force for this terrorist atrocity that Heaney represents. Moreover, the way in which the sledgehammer is described as being planted in the wall makes use of a pun here that creates a sense of ambiguity, describing firstly the impact of the hammer's head on the wall, but also this alarmingly positive connotation of planting something with the idea of growth, which I think brings in ironic contrast the destruction at the source of the poem to the foreground. This planting is resulting in the smashing of a wall rather than the growth of something. This is also built in the adverbial phrase unyieldingly as a club-footed last. That unyielding movement is a pun, I think, on a return of perhaps a crop yield or an investment or something giving in. There's a sense of paranoia about the stubbornness, perhaps, of these iron-headed terrorists who have committed atrocities, such as the ones described. The simile also as a club-footed last gives us this sense of permanent damage, that the stubbornness itself is going to lead in some way to the club-footed deformity that we see in a last. Furthermore, the anger that's released like a long-nursed rage gives us this sense of simmering resentment. The power of the physical movement of the sledgehammer being compared to the slow simmering resentment and anger that has accumulated in parts of the world, for example, the Middle East, that has motivated the smashing of the Twin Towers and the terrorist atrocities that have underpinned it. Finally, there's this alarming example of personification in Heaney's concluding lines, where the staked earth quailed and shivered in the handle of the sledgehammer as it smashed into the ground. Now that personification reverses scale, where the earth itself is given the qualities of fear as it quails and shivers in the vibrations of the handle of the sledgehammer. And that reverse of scale gives us this perverse sense of something very small, the handle of the sledgehammer, having power over this vast entity of the earth, which is quailing and shivering. And that's where the problematic nature of this power is most powerfully foregrounded, where an awareness of having this power threatens to turn something as vast as the globe upside down and to destabilize hierarchies that perhaps are keeping the world safe. So while the language may seem to display a precise sense of veneration and respect for the power at its heart, and through the worshipful visual imagery focused on the Father, Heaney seems to conclude that this can and threatens to spiral out of control once this power shifts into conscious awareness. And so While other writers seem to see the tragic consequences of power as the preserve of the powerful, Heaney in A Shiver seems to suggest his through his extended metaphor that this conscious awareness can affect anyone, and that's precisely what makes it alarming, that power is available to all the minute people realize it. And so we might see Heaney's poem as a cautionary warning about the dangerous consequences of the free availability and increasing self-consciousness of this power in our new global era.